It is 1893, and the Waldorf Hotel, a gleaming beacon of luxury, opens its doors to New York's elite. Beneath its polished exterior, however, lies a hidden world far from the view of the wealthy guests. For every 4 or 5 guest rooms, there exists a secret floor. 100 servant rooms where a workforce of hundreds labors around the clock. This invisible army sustains the Waldorf's reputation, ensuring the immaculate service that has come to define the hotel. But when this hidden labor force strikes in 1934, the delicate balance of wealth, class, and power is disrupted forever. What happens when the invisible hands that keep luxury alive decide to be seen? Chapter 1. The dream that demanded everything. In the late 1800s, the Waldorf Hotel was born out of a vision to create a monument to American luxury, a place where the wealthy could revel in opulence beyond their wildest dreams. William Waldorf Astor stood at the corner of 5th Avenue and 33rd Street in 1891, surveying the plot of land that would transform his family's legacy. The Astors had built their fortune on fur trading and Manhattan real estate, accumulating wealth that rivaled European royalty. But wealth alone was not enough. William Waldorf wanted something more permanent than money. He wanted to build a temple to American aristocracy, a structure that would outlast him and define what it meant to live at the pinnacle of society. The vision was audacious. 450 guest rooms spread across 13 floors. Not simply rooms, but suites designed to rival the private residences of millionaires. Each space would feature hand-carved mahogany furniture imported from Europe, silk wallpapers from France, and Persian rugs thick enough to silence footsteps. The hotel would offer amenities unheard of in America: private bathrooms with hot and cold running water, electric lighting in every room, and telephone service connecting guests to the outside world without ever leaving their chambers. The architect, Henry Hardenberg, received a simple directive from Astor: build the most magnificent hotel in the world, spare no expense. The budget ballooned to $1.5 million, a staggering sum equivalent to over $47 million in modern currency. But Astor understood that luxury was not merely about comfort. It was about creating an experience so seamless, so perfect, that guests would forget they were in a hotel at all. The construction began in 1891. 300 workers labored for 2 years, raising steel beams and laying ornate marble floors. The hotel's exterior would be clad in granite and limestone, its facade decorated with intricate terracotta details. Inside, the main dining room alone would span 60 feet by 100 feet, with ceilings 25 feet high, adorned with gold leaf and crystal chandeliers weighing over 2,000 pounds each. But the true genius of the Waldorf lay not in what guests could see. It lay in what they could not. For the hotel to function as Astor envisioned, it required an infrastructure as complex as a small city, in kitchens capable of serving hundreds of meals simultaneously, laundries that could process thousands of sheets and towels daily, storage rooms for linens, china, and silverware, mechanical rooms housing the boilers and electrical generators that powered the building, and most critically, housing for the army of workers who would operate this machinery of luxury. The Gilded Age demanded perfection from its institutions. The wealthy industrialists and financiers who would patronize the Waldorf expected service that was instantaneous and invisible. They wanted their needs anticipated before they were expressed, their problems solved before they were noticed. This level of service required not just skill, but numbers. Hundreds of people working in coordinated silence, maintaining the illusion that luxury simply existed naturally, requiring no human effort. Astor and Hardenberg understood this fundamental truth. The hotel's grandeur depended entirely on hiding the mechanisms that produced it. The question was not whether to employ hundreds of workers. The question was how to keep them out of sight. The answer would be built into the very architecture of the building, creating a two-tiered world that defined class division in physical space. Above, elegance. Below and behind, the machinery of service. A perfect system, as long as those operating it remained invisible. When the Waldorf opened its doors on March 13, 1893, New York society gathered to witness the birth of American luxury. They marveled at the marble staircases and gilded ballrooms. They praised the innovation and ambition. But they never thought to ask about the hands that polished those marble floors, or the bodies that hauled luggage up back staircases, while guests rode in cushioned elevators. The dream had been realized. Now it had to be maintained. So Chapter 2, the architecture of class. As the hotel's construction began, the design decisions made by Astor and his architects would set the stage for a labor force that would remain unseen by those enjoying the luxuries inside. The blueprints for the Waldorf Hotel revealed a building designed for segregation. Not the explicit, legal segregation that defined much of American society, but something more insidious. An architectural segregation that made class division seem natural, inevitable, even necessary. Henry Hardenberg's design divided the 13-story building into distinct zones. The first 2 floors belonged to the public, grand lobbies with marble columns 20 feet tall, reception halls with coffered ceilings, the famous Peacock Alley, a 300-foot corridor where society women promenaded in gowns worth thousands of dollars, their jewelry catching the light from hundreds of electric bulbs. Floors 3 through 12 housed the guest rooms. That these were the profit centers, the spaces that justified the entire enterprise. Each floor contained between 30 and 40 suites, arranged around a central corridor. The rooms facing Fifth Avenue commanded premium prices, offering views of the city's most fashionable thoroughfare. Interior rooms cost less, but still provided every amenity a wealthy guest might desire. The 13th floor was different. This was where the hidden world began. 100 servant rooms occupied the top floor, each measuring roughly 10 feet by 12 feet. These were not the cramped quarters of live and domestic servants in private homes. They were purpose-built housing for the hotel's essential workforce, but they were deliberately isolated from the guest experience, accessible only through separate staircases that began in the basement and bypassed every guest floor entirely. The architecture enforced invisibility through deliberate design choices. Service elevators ran in separate shafts from guest elevators. Staff corridors paralleled guest corridors, but never intersected them. Kitchen access came through underground tunnels connecting to service entrances on side streets, ensuring that delivery wagons and food suppliers never appeared at the main entrance on Fifth Avenue. Every 4 to 5 guest rooms required 1 servant room. The ratio was precise, calculated to ensure adequate staffing without creating overcrowding. For 450 guest rooms, 100 servant rooms provided housing for the essential overnight staff. Chambermaids who prepared rooms in early morning hours, night porters who handled luggage and room service during late shifts, laundry workers who operated the industrial washing machines and mangles in basement facilities, kitchen staff who began preparing breakfast at 4 in the morning. The spatial organization created a vertical hierarchy that mirrored social hierarchy. The wealthy occupied the middle, the most desirable space with the best views and easiest access. The working class occupied the extremes, the basement and the top floor, the spaces farthest from public view. But the segregation went beyond simple floor assignments. The servant quarters featured none of the luxuries found in guest rooms. No private bathrooms. Communal facilities at the end of each hallway served 20 workers. No telephones. No electric call buttons to summon assistance. No carpeting or decorative wallpaper. Plain plaster walls painted institutional white. Bare wooden floors that echoed with every footstep. Windows in the servant rooms faced alleys and rear courtyards, never the grand avenues. Natural light was minimal. Ventilation was poor. In summer, the top floor became stifling as heat rose through the building. In winter, it was the coldest area of the hotel, the coal-fired heating system, prioritizing guest comfort over worker welfare. The building's mechanical systems reinforced this division. Steam pipes and electrical conduits ran through the servant areas with no attempt at concealment. Exposed infrastructure turned functional spaces into industrial zones, visually distinct from the carefully decorated public areas. A worker moving from the servant quarters to a guest floor experienced a jarring transition, stepping from industrial utility into palatial luxury within seconds. Hardenberg had created what architectural historians would later call a servant architecture, a design philosophy that treated workers as functional components of the building rather than human occupants. The servant rooms were storage spaces for labor, designed for maximum efficiency rather than livability. The genius of the system was its invisibility to those it was designed to serve. Guests arriving at the Waldorf saw only the front stage. The marble, the gold, the crystal. They never glimpsed the backstage. The narrow corridors, the institutional dormitories, the industrial machinery. The architecture made it easy to believe that the hotel simply functioned through some mysterious alchemy, that clean sheets appeared and dirty dishes disappeared through forces as natural as the sunrise. This was not accidental. This was intentional. The building itself was a mechanism for maintaining class boundaries, for ensuring that the wealthy never had to confront the human cost of their comfort. And it worked. For 40 years, it worked perfectly, until the day the invisible became visible, and the architecture of class could no longer contain the people it was designed to hide. Chapter 3: The labor force that made it all possible. Beneath the Waldorf's lavish exterior, more than 600 workers toiled in silence, maintaining the hotel's world-class standards. The workforce was an organism, complex, interconnected, precisely calibrated. 637 employees on the opening day roster. By 1895, that number had swelled to over 800. Each person occupied a specific role in an intricate hierarchy that made the hotel function. At the top of the worker pyramid stood the managers. The general manager, who interfaced with ownership and set overall policy. The rooms manager, who oversaw all guest accommodations. The food and beverage director, who controlled the multiple restaurants and banquet facilities. These men earned comfortable salaries, $50 to $75 per week, and they lived in private apartments outside the hotel. Below them came the department heads, the head concierge, who managed a team of doormen and errand runners, the chief engineer, responsible for the boilers, generators, and mechanical systems that kept the building operational. The head housekeeper, a woman who commanded an army of chambermaids with military precision. The executive chef, who supervised a kitchen brigade of 60 cooks, pastry chefs, and kitchen assistants. Department heads earned $30 to $40 per week, respectable middle-class wages for the era. They lived in modest apartments in Manhattan or Brooklyn, commuting to work on streetcars and elevated trains. Then came the skilled workers. Waiters in the main dining room earned tips that could double or triple their base salary of $12 per week. The best waiters, assigned to serve the wealthiest regular guests, could take home $30 or $40 in a good week. Bartenders, cooks, and tailors, who provided in-house clothing, repair, all occupied this tier. They had trade skills, and they knew their value, but the majority of the workforce existed at the bottom of the pyramid. The chambermaids, porters, dishwashers, and laundry workers who formed the true invisible army. These workers earned between $6 and $10 per week. Women earned less than men for comparable work. African American workers earned less than white workers, regardless of skill or experience. For many of these workers, the servant rooms on the 13th floor were not temporary housing. They were home. A chambermaid named Mary Sullivan, who started at the Waldorf in 1894, lived in room 1327 for 11 years. Her entire life fit into a 10 by 12 foot space, a narrow bed, a small dresser, a single chair, a kerosene lamp for the evenings when she was not working, which were rare. Mary's day began at 5 in the morning. She would dress in her uniform, a simple black dress with white apron and cap, and descend the back stairs to the housekeeper's office. There she would receive her assignment. 12 rooms to clean before the 1 o'clock deadline. 12 rooms meant making 24 beds, emptying and cleaning 12 chamber pots before indoor plumbing became standard, dusting every surface, sweeping and mopping floors, replacing towels and linens, and ensuring that everything appeared untouched, pristine, ready for occupancy. The work was exhausting. A chambermaid walked an estimated 8 to 10 miles per day, climbing stairs, pushing heavy cleaning carts, and hauling buckets of water. Her hands were perpetually raw from the harsh soaps used to clean bathrooms and floors. Her back ached from bending and scrubbing. And she was expected to be invisible. If a guest appeared in a hallway, she was to flatten herself against the wall and lower her eyes until they passed. The hotel's service standards demanded this invisibility. The management manual, a 100-page document that governed every aspect of worker behavior, was explicit. Staff must never speak to guests unless addressed directly. Staff must never make eye contact with guests. Staff must never use the main elevators or walk through public corridors. Staff must maintain absolute silence while working in guest areas. Violations resulted in immediate termination. No appeals, no second chances. The labor market in 1890s New York was saturated with desperate workers. Immigrants arriving by the thousands at Ellis Island saw rural Americans fleeing agricultural poverty for city wages. The Waldorf could replace any worker within hours. This replaceability shaped the entire labor system. Workers had no bargaining power, no job security, no benefits. If you became sick or injured, you were fired. If you complained about conditions, you were fired. If you could not maintain the punishing pace, you were fired. The 800 workers formed a machine, each person a cog designed to perform a specific function. The chambermaids cleaned, the porters carried, the cooks prepared, the waiters served, the laundry workers washed, the engineers maintained, the doormen greeted, the telephone operators connected, the seamstresses repaired, the florists arranged, the dishwashers scrubbed, and above them all, the guests enjoyed a seamless experience, utterly unconscious of the hundreds of people working in synchronized choreography to create the illusion that luxury was effortless. And the economic equation was brutally simple. The hotel charged premium prices for rooms, $5 per night for a single room, equivalent to an entire week's wages for a chambermaid, $10 to $15 for suites. These rates generated enormous revenue. In a typical month, the Waldorf collected over $60,000 in room charges alone. The profit margin depended on keeping labor costs low. If the hotel paid workers fairly, and if it provided adequate housing and reasonable working hours, the economics would not work. The luxury would not be affordable to the wealthy patrons. So the system required exploitation. It was not a flaw in the design. It was the design. William Waldorf Astor had created his monument to American luxury, but it stood on a foundation of human exhaustion, desperation, and systematic inequality. A foundation that would prove far less stable than the steel and stone of the building itself. Yet the workers understood this. They saw the contradiction every day. They polished silver serving pieces worth more than their annual salary. They made beds covered in linens finer than any fabric they would ever own. They served meals that cost more than they earned in a month, and they said nothing because they needed the work, because they had no choice, because the system was designed to give them no choice. But systems built on exploitation carry within them the seeds of their own destruction. It would take 40 years for those seeds to germinate. But when they did, the harvest would be bitter for those who had sown them. Chapter 4. Secrets of the Servant Quarters. Up on the upper floors, far removed from the glamour and the guests, was a world of hidden labor, unseen by anyone who wasn't part of it. The 13th floor was a city within a city. 100 rooms arranged in a grid pattern, connected by narrow corridors painted institutional beige. The air smelled of lye soap, kerosene, and human bodies living in close quarters. The constant background noise of footsteps, conversations through thin walls, and the rumble of the service elevators created a soundscape utterly unlike the hushed elegance of the guest floors below. Room assignments followed a strict hierarchy even within the servant quarters. The most senior workers, those with 5 or more years of service, occupied rooms near the communal bathrooms, minimizing their walk in the middle of the night. Newer workers took rooms at the far ends of corridors, the least convenient locations. Single women occupied one wing, single men occupied another. Married couples, a rarity among live-in staff, received slightly larger rooms on the north side. The rooms themselves were furnished identically. One iron frame bed with a thin mattress stuffed with horsehair. One wooden dresser with 4 drawers. One straight-backed chair. One small washstand with a basin and pitcher for morning ablutions. One mirror, perhaps 12 inches square. One window, usually facing an air shaft or alley. The total square footage was 120 square feet per person. Compare this to the smallest guest rooms at 350 square feet, and the largest suites at over 1,000 square feet. Privacy was impossible. The walls between rooms were thin plaster over wood lath. Every conversation, every cough, Every moment of illness or intimacy was audible to neighbors. The doors had no locks. Management could enter at any time to conduct inspections, searching for contraband, unauthorized guests, or evidence of moral violations such as alcohol consumption. The bathrooms served 20 workers each, 5 shared toilets, 3 shared sinks, 2 shared bathtubs. Hot water was available only during limited hours, 6 to 8 in the morning and 6 to 8 in the evening. And workers on different shifts often missed these windows entirely, forced to bathe in cold water or not at all. The bathtubs had a 15-minute time limit, enforced by the floor supervisors who monitored usage. Laundry facilities for personal clothing did not exist in the servant quarters. Workers washed their own clothes in the bathroom sinks and hung them to dry in their rooms. In humid summer months, the 13th floor became a warren of drying laundry, the moisture creating oppressive conditions and encouraging mold growth in the poorly ventilated spaces. The rules governing the servant quarters were extensive and strictly enforced. No visitors allowed under any circumstances. No cooking in rooms, no candles or oil lamps lit after 10 in the evening, no loud noises after 9, no gatherings of more than 3 workers in any room, no posting of personal items on walls, no rearranging of furniture, no alterations to the space whatsoever. Violations resulted in fines deducted from already meager wages. A noise complaint meant losing 50 cents, nearly a full day's pay for a chambermaid. Unauthorized visitors resulted in a $2 fine and a written warning. 3 written warnings meant termination. Despite these restrictions, the workers created community in the cramped quarters. They shared food purchased from street vendors or saved from the staff dining hall. They played cards and dice for pennies. They sang songs from their home countries, Poland and Ireland and Italy and Germany. They celebrated birthdays and holidays with whatever small luxuries they could afford. They courted and fell in love and conducted relationships in stolen moments between shifts. But the physical conditions took a relentless toll. Respiratory illnesses spread rapidly through the crowded quarters. Tuberculosis was endemic among workers in the 1910s and 20s, killing dozens, and bedbugs and lice were constant problems. The hotel provided no medical care for workers. If you became ill, you treated yourself or sought help from charity hospitals that provided care to the poor. The most grueling labor happened in the spaces below the guest rooms. The basement level contained the true machinery of the hotel. Industrial laundries where steam-filled rooms reached temperatures exceeding 110 degrees Fahrenheit. Workers, predominantly women, operated mangles and pressing machines that could crush fingers or burn arms if attention lapsed for even a moment. The laundry processed 2,000 pounds of linens daily: sheets, towels, tablecloths, napkins, staff uniforms. Everything had to be washed, dried, pressed, and folded to hotel standards. The workday in the laundry began at 5 in the morning and continued until 7 in the evening. 2 shifts of 20 workers each, laboring in heat and humidity that left them perpetually dehydrated and exhausted. Agnes Murphy worked in the laundry from 1898 until 1906, when she collapsed from heat exhaustion during a summer heat wave. She was 32 years old. The hotel sent her to Bellevue Hospital and replaced her the next day. Agnes never returned to work. She died 3 years later, her lungs permanently damaged by years of breathing steam laced with bleach and lye. The kitchens were equally demanding. The main kitchen operated 20 hours per day, shutting down only between 2 and 6 in the morning for deep cleaning. The executive chef commanded a brigade of 60 workers divided into specialized stations. Garde-manger for cold dishes, saucier for sauces, rôtisseur for roasted meats, pâtissier for pastries and desserts, entremetier for vegetables, poissonnier for fish. At the bottom of the kitchen, hierarchy labored the plongeurs, the dishwashers, 8 men working in shifts, standing at massive sinks filled with scalding water, scrubbing pots, pans, plates, silverware, crystal glassware. The water contained harsh soaps that stripped skin of its natural oils, leaving hands cracked and bleeding. The heat from the water combined with the heat from the cooking stations turned the dishwashing area into a furnace. Thomas Chen, a Chinese immigrant who worked as a plonger from 1900 until 1923, later recalled the work. "My hands were never dry, never clean, really clean. The soap got into cuts and burned. The heat made breathing hard. But you could not slow down. The dishes kept coming. Mountains of dishes. If you fell behind, you were fired." The storage areas occupied vast spaces in the sub-basement. Wine cellars holding 10,000 bottles, dry goods storage with flour, sugar, rice, and other staples purchased in bulk. Walk-in refrigerators cooled by massive ice blocks replaced daily, where butchered meats hung on hooks and fresh produce was stored in bins. Porters moved supplies from these storage areas to the kitchens and service floors, hauling loads up narrow stairs because the service elevators were reserved for clean linens and prepared food. A porter might carry 60 pounds of flour or a case of wine up 3 flights of stairs a dozen times per shift. The engineering spaces housed the boilers that produce steam for heating and hot water, the electrical generators that powered the lights and elevators, the water pumps that maintained pressure throughout the 13 floors. These mechanical systems required constant monitoring and maintenance. Engineers worked 4-hour shifts around the clock, checking gauges, adjusting valves, lubricating machinery, replacing worn parts. The heat in the boiler rooms was intense, often exceeding 120 degrees. Workers wore minimal clothing and drank gallons of water per shift. Burns from touching hot pipes or boiler surfaces were common. The noise from the machinery was deafening, leaving many engineers partially deaf after years of service. All of this labor, all of this infrastructure, all of this hidden world existed for a single purpose: to ensure that when a wealthy guest pressed a call button in their room, a uniformed worker appeared within 3 minutes to fulfill their request. To ensure that when a guest walked through the lobby, they saw only pristine surfaces and smiling faces. To ensure that the machinery of luxury remained completely invisible. The workers understood the equation. Their suffering produced someone else's pleasure. Their exhaustion enabled someone else's leisure. Their poverty subsidized someone else's luxury. This knowledge created a quiet resentment that simmered beneath the surface of professional courtesy. But for decades, that resentment had no outlet. The workers were too desperate, too replaceable, too systematically disempowered to protest. The system had been designed to prevent collective action. Different departments worked different shifts, limiting interaction. Multiple languages and ethnic groups created barriers to organization. The constant threat of termination kept everyone isolated and afraid. The servant quarters and the hidden labor spaces were not just physical locations. They were a social and economic structure designed to extract maximum value from human beings while providing minimum compensation and dignity. They were capitalism in its purest, most brutal form. And they were unsustainable. Not morally, though they were morally indefensible, but practically, because no system built on such exploitation can last forever, because human beings have limits to what they will endure, because eventually, even the most powerless find ways to claim power. The question was not whether the system would break. The question was when and how and what would replace it. Chapter 5. The Unseen Workers' Lives. While the wealthy guests reveled in luxury, the lives of the workers who served them were a far cry from the glamorous world below. Marie Kowalski arrived at Ellis Island in February of 1902. She was 19 years old, traveling alone from a village outside Warsaw. She carried a single trunk containing 2 dresses, undergarments, a pair of shoes, a prayer book, and a photograph of her parents. She had $12 sewn into the lining of her coat. She spoke no English. By March, she was working at the Waldorf as a chambermaid, earning $7 per week. Her room on the 13th floor was the first space she had ever occupied alone. In Poland, she had shared a bedroom with her 3 sisters. Privacy was a luxury she had never known. But as she lay on the narrow bed that first night, listening to unfamiliar voices through the thin walls, she felt a loneliness so profound it was physical. Marie's story was repeated thousands of times. The Waldorf's workforce was composed almost entirely of immigrants and their children. Irish, Italian, German, Polish, Hungarian, Russian, Chinese, Greek. They came seeking opportunity, fleeing poverty and persecution, chasing the American dream. What they found was work that ground them down, day after day, until their bodies gave out or their spirits broke. The working hours were punishing. Chambermaids worked 6 days per week, 10 to 12 hours per day. Sundays were supposed to be a day of rest, but workers were required to attend the staff meeting at 8 in the morning, where the week's disciplinary actions were announced and new rules were introduced. The meeting often lasted 2 hours, cutting into the only time workers had for church, for rest, for life beyond the hotel. Other departments had even worse schedules. Kitchen staff worked 7 days per week during busy seasons, with shifts that could stretch to 14 hours. Laundry workers labored through holidays because guest linens had to be cleaned regardless of the calendar. Engineers and maintenance workers rotated through overnight shifts, their circadian rhythms permanently disrupted. The pay was calculated to keep workers perpetually dependent. $7 per week was just enough to survive, but never enough to save. After paying for uniforms, which workers had to provide themselves, and after paying fines for minor infractions, a chambermaid might take home $6.50. From this, she had to purchase any food beyond the staff meals provided by the hotel, any personal items like soap and toothpaste, any clothing beyond her work uniform. Saving money was nearly impossible. Building a financial cushion that might allow a worker to quit and seek better employment was out of reach. The system was designed to trap workers in perpetual dependence on their employer. The food provided to workers was adequate in quantity, but poor in quality. The staff dining hall served 2 meals per day, breakfast and dinner. Breakfast was typically oatmeal or cornmeal mush, bread, and coffee. Dinner was stew, usually made from meat scraps and vegetables past their prime, served with potatoes and more bread. Fresh fruit was rare. Fresh milk was reserved for guests. The contrast with guest dining was stark. Upstairs, in the main restaurant, guests dined on oysters, filet mignon, lobster thermidor, and champagne. Downstairs, and workers ate institutional food designed for maximum efficiency and minimum cost. The message was clear. You are not valued. You are fuel for the machine. Health problems were endemic among the workforce. Respiratory diseases from poor ventilation and exposure to harsh cleaning chemicals. Joint problems from the physical demands of the work. Digestive issues from the poor quality food. Dental problems that went untreated because workers could not afford dentists. Vision problems from working in dim light. The hotel provided no health insurance, no sick pay, no disability benefits. If you could not work, you did not get paid. If you missed more than 2 days, you were fired. Workers came to their shifts with fevers, with injuries, with illnesses that should have meant bed rest. They had no choice. Josephine Moretti worked as a waitress in the hotel's cafe from 1908 until 1914. She developed chronic back pain from carrying heavy trays, but she could not afford to see a doctor. She treated herself with patent medicines purchased from street vendors. By 1912, the pain was so severe she could barely walk. She continued working because she had no savings, no family support, nowhere else to go. In 1914, she collapsed during a lunch shift. The hotel sent her to Bellevue Hospital, where doctors discovered advanced spinal deterioration. She was 28 years old. She would never work again. The emotional toll was as severe as the physical. Workers were required to be cheerful, deferential, grateful. They were expected to absorb abuse from guests without reaction. A guest who was dissatisfied with their room could berate a chambermaid for 10 minutes, and she was required to apologize and promise to do better. A guest who found their steak overcooked could humiliate a waiter in front of a full dining room, and he had to accept it with a smile. This emotional labor, the constant suppression of authentic feeling, created psychological damage that was never acknowledged or addressed. Workers developed what we would now recognize as depression and anxiety disorders. But in the early 1900s, there was no mental health support for working-class people. You endured or you broke. Relationships were the one source of genuine joy in workers' lives. Romance flourished in the servant quarters, despite the rules against it. Couples would sneak moments together in storage closets and empty guest rooms. They would pass notes through intermediaries. They would save their pennies to buy each other small gifts on birthdays and holidays. Some relationships led to marriage. The hotel reluctantly allowed married couples to share rooms in the servant quarters, though they were expected to continue working full shifts. Children were not permitted, and pregnant women were immediately fired. Many workers who wanted families had to choose between their relationship and their job. Sarah and Patrick O'Connor met at the Waldorf in 1905. She was a chambermaid. He was a porter. They fell in love over stolen conversations during shift changes. They married in 1907 at a small Catholic church in the Bronx. They shared a room on the 13th floor for 8 years, working opposite shifts, yet seeing each other for brief hours in between. When Sarah became pregnant in 1915, she was fired immediately. Patrick continued working, but his wages alone were not enough to support a family. They moved to a tenement in the Lower East Side, where Sarah died in childbirth. Patrick quit the Waldorf the next day. The workers formed unofficial support networks to survive. Ethnic communities within the workforce pooled resources, lending money to each other during emergencies, sharing information about better jobs, providing emotional support during hard times. The Irish chambermaids had a benevolent society that collected dues and provided small payments when members were too ill to work. The Italian kitchen workers had a similar organization. These networks operated in secret because the hotel management viewed any worker organization with suspicion. Despite everything, despite the exhaustion and the poverty and the indignity, many workers took pride in their skills. A chambermaid who could make a bed with hospital corners that would satisfy the head housekeeper's inspection. A cook who could prepare a perfect béarnaise sauce. A porter who could efficiently pack a steamer trunk. These were real accomplishments, and workers knew it. But pride could not erase the fundamental injustice of the system. Workers were creating immense value, generating enormous profits for the hotel's owners and investors. The Waldorf's annual profit in 1910 was over $200,000, equivalent to $6 million today. This profit was extracted directly from the labor of workers who earned poverty wages and lived in cramped dormitories. The workers saw this. They understood the economics, even if they lacked the vocabulary to articulate it in political terms. They knew they were being exploited. They knew the system was rigged against them, and they knew they were powerless to change it. But knowledge is a form of power. Understanding exploitation is the first step toward resisting it. The workers were learning slowly that their individual powerlessness might be overcome through collective action. That if they stood together, they could not all be fired. That they had leverage if only they could organize to use it. The conditions in the servant quarters and the realities of workers' lives were creating the preconditions for rebellion. Not immediately, not all at once, but inevitably. The only question was what spark would ignite the fire. Chapter 6. When the system cracked. In 1934, the Waldorf's hidden army of workers rose up, walking out of their posts and shattering the illusion of seamless service. The Great Depression changed everything. When the stock market crashed in October of 1929, the reverberations shook every sector of the American economy. But the luxury hotel industry, independent on the discretionary spending of the wealthy, was particularly vulnerable. By 1930, occupancy at the Waldorf had dropped from 90% to 60%. By 1932, it was below 50%, 32. It was below 50%. The hotel that once turned away guests now advertised special rates to attract business. Rooms that had commanded $15 per night were available for $7. Suites were discounted by half. Management responded to declining revenue with predictable brutality. Labor costs had to be cut. Wages were reduced across the board. Chambermaids who had earned $9 per week in 1929 were cut to $6 in 1931, then to $5 in 1933. Kitchen workers saw similar reductions. The only workers spared were those in positions that directly interacted with guests, waiters, and concierges, whose tips supplemented their reduced wages. Simultaneously, workloads increased. The hotel laid off 20% of its workforce, but expected the remaining workers to maintain the same standards. Chambermaids who once cleaned 12 rooms per day were now assigned 16. Kitchen workers who once worked 10-hour shifts were now working 12 and 14 hours. The surviving workers were squeezed harder to compensate for the missing labor. The worker housing situation deteriorated. The hotel began charging rent for the servant quarters, $2 per week, deducted automatically from wages. This was ostensibly to offset the costs of maintaining the building, but it was transparently a way to extract more money from workers who had none to give. The combination of reduced wages, increased workloads, and new rent charges created a crisis. Workers who had barely survived on their pre-depression wages now faced genuine destitution. Many relied on bread lines and soup kitchens to supplement the inadequate staff meals. Some workers were literally starving while serving elaborate meals to the wealthy guests who still patronized the hotel. But the Depression also created new possibilities. The political climate was shifting. The labor movement, which had been suppressed during the prosperous 1920s, was experiencing a resurgence. The election of Franklin Roosevelt in 1932 brought a president who was at least rhetorically sympathetic to workers' rights. The National Industrial Recovery Act of 1933 included provisions protecting the right to organize unions. Union organizers saw opportunity in the luxury hotels. The Hotel Trades Council, an umbrella organization representing multiple craft unions in the hospitality industry, began a concerted effort to organize New York's major hotels. The Waldorf, with its hundreds of workers and high-profile status, was a prime target. Organizers faced significant challenges. The hotel's workforce was divided by department, by shift, by ethnicity, by language. Creating unity among chambermaids and cooks and porters and laundry workers required overcoming decades of systematic division, and the hotel management, aware of the organizing efforts, began an anti-union campaign. Supervisors warned workers that joining a union would result in termination. Known union sympathizers were fired on pretexts. The hotel hired private security agents to monitor workers and identify organizers. Despite this opposition, the organizing continued. Meetings were held in rented halls, in churches, in workers' apartments. Organizers distributed leaflets outside the hotel. They made the case that collective bargaining was the only way to improve conditions, that solidarity could overcome the power imbalance, that workers deserved dignity and fair compensation. Slowly, the message resonated. By early 1934, a majority of the Waldorf's workers had signed union cards. The Hotel Trades Council demanded recognition and negotiation. Management refused. The stage was set for confrontation. The strike began on the evening of March 15th, 1934. The timing was deliberate. Thursday evening, when the hotel was at its busiest, when the restaurants were full and guests were checking in for weekend stays. At 7 in the evening, chambermaids walked off their floors. Kitchen workers left their stations. Porters set down their luggage carts. Waiters removed their aprons and walked out of dining rooms mid-service. Over 400 workers joined the walkout. They gathered on the sidewalk outside the Fifth Avenue entrance, carrying hastily made signs. Few fair wages for hotel workers. We demand union recognition. No more starvation pay. The effect on the hotel was immediate and catastrophic. Guests checking in found no porters to carry their luggage. Diners in the middle of their meals found no waiters to bring the next course. The kitchen ground to a halt, unable to function without the prep cooks and dishwashers who had walked out. Rooms went uncleaned. Linens went unwashed. Management scrambled to respond. They called in supervisors to perform basic tasks. The room's manager carried luggage. The food and beverage director bussed tables. The general manager personally checked in guests at the front desk. It was absurd and unsustainable. The hotel could not function without its workers, and everyone knew it. The strike exposed something the hotel had worked for 4 decades to conceal: the complete dependence of luxury on labor. Without the chambermaids, the rooms became dirty. Without the cooks, the restaurants could not serve. Without the porters, the logistics collapsed. The invisible army, once made visible, revealed the fundamental truth. The workers were essential. The guests were not. Local newspapers covered the strike with fascination. Reporters interviewed striking workers who described their wages and working conditions. The public learned that the people who served them lobster and champagne were struggling to afford bread. The contrast was shocking, even in an era accustomed to gross inequality. The strike lasted 6 days. Management finally agreed to negotiate when it became clear that the hotel could not operate without capitulating to worker demands. The resulting contract was a modest victory for the workers, a 10% wage increase, bringing chambermaids back to $8 per week, a reduction in the workday to 9 hours, down from 10 or 12, an end to the rent charges for worker housing, and most importantly, a recognition of the union and the right to bargain collectively. But the real victory was psychological. The workers had discovered their power. They had stood together and forced management to negotiate. They had made themselves visible and demanded recognition. The system that had been designed to keep them powerless and invisible had cracked, and everyone could see the fracture. The 1934 strike at the Waldorf was not unique. Similar strikes erupted at luxury hotels across New York and in other major cities. The wave of labor action in the mid-1930s fundamentally changed the hotel industry. Workers who had been treated as disposable and powerless began to assert their rights and demand respect. The Waldorf would never be the same. The illusion of effortless luxury had been shattered. Guests could no longer pretend that the service they enjoyed came without human cost. The invisible workers had stepped into the light, and they would not return to the shadows. The system had cracked, but the full collapse was still to come. Chapter 7. The strike that changed everything. The night the Waldorf workers walked out during dinner service, the world of New York's elite hospitality was never the same. The evening of March 15th, 1934, began like any other Thursday at the Waldorf. The main dining room was fully booked, every table occupied by Manhattan's elite. The soft murmur of conversation, the clink of crystal glasses, the discreet footsteps of waiters moving between tables, all created the atmosphere of refined elegance the hotel had perfected over 4 decades. At precisely 7 o'clock, that atmosphere shattered. Albert Morrison, a waiter with 16 years of service at the hotel, set down the silver tray he was carrying and removed his white gloves. He placed them carefully on the serving station. He straightened his jacket and walked through the dining room toward the main entrance. As he passed other waiters, he caught their eyes. Some nodded, others hesitated, then followed. By 7:15, 12 of the 16 waiters working the dining room that evening had walked out. The remaining 4, all senior staff who disagreed with the strike, attempted to continue service. But 4 waiters could not serve a dining room of 200 guests. Diners waited 30 minutes for courses that never arrived. Some demanded to speak with managers. Others, reading the situation correctly, left without finishing their meals. The walkout was coordinated across all departments simultaneously. In the kitchens, cooks stepped away from their stations. Ovens were left on, pans of sauce reduced on burners. The head chef attempted to continue preparing orders, but without his brigade, the task was impossible. By 7:30, the kitchen had ceased functioning. Chambermaids on the evening shift, responsible for turning down beds and refreshing guest rooms, simply stopped working. They left their carts in hallways and took the staff elevators to the ground floor, exiting through the service entrance to join the growing crowd on the sidewalk. Porters abandoned luggage in the lobby. Telephone operators unplugged from their switchboards. Laundry workers shut down the mangles and walked out of the basement. Even some of the engineers left their posts, though a skeleton crew remained to ensure that critical systems like heat and water remained operational. The hotel management was caught completely off guard. The general manager, Richard Havmeyer, had been aware of union organizing efforts, but had dismissed them as unlikely to succeed. The hotel's anti-union campaign had been aggressive, and he believed it had been effective. He was wrong, and Havmeyer's immediate response was to try to minimize the disruption. He ordered supervisors to fill in for striking workers. But supervisors, even those willing to help, lacked the skills and numbers to maintain operations. A rooms manager who had not made a bed in 20 years could not replicate the efficiency of an experienced chambermaid. A food and beverage director could not cook a multi-course meal. By 9 in the evening, the hotel had effectively ceased functioning. The front desk was accepting no new check-ins. The restaurants had closed. Room service was unavailable. Guests already in residence were informed that no housekeeping services would be provided until further notice. Outside, on Fifth Avenue, the striking workers created a picket line. Over 400 people marched in a loop in front of the main entrance. They carried signs and chanted slogans. Fair wages now. Recognize the union. No more slave labor. The visual spectacle was unprecedented. For decades, these workers had been invisible, hidden in back corridors and servant quarters. Now they were impossible to ignore, directly in front of one of Manhattan's most prestigious addresses, demanding to be seen and heard. The press arrived quickly. Reporters from the New York Times, the Herald Tribune, the Daily News, and the tabloid papers all sent journalists to cover the story. Photographers captured images of chambermaids in their uniforms standing on picket lines. The contrast between the elegant hotel facade and the working-class protesters created powerful imagery. Interviews with striking workers revealed conditions that shocked even jaded New Yorkers. A chambermaid named Rosa Sanchez told a Times reporter that she earned $5 per week, down from $9 before the Depression. She worked 6 days a week, 12 hours per day, and she lived in a 10 by 12-foot room with no private bathroom. She could not afford to buy new shoes, and the holes in her current pair had been repaired with cardboard. A cook named James O'Malley described wages cut by 40%, while his workload increased by 50%. He worked 7 days per week during busy seasons. He had not had a day off in 6 weeks. He suffered from burns on his arms from hot ovens and chronic back pain from standing for 14 hours at a time. These stories humanized the abstract concept of labor exploitation. Readers could understand the injustice when confronted with specific individuals and concrete details. The sympathy shifted decisively toward the workers. The political climate was crucial to the strike's success. Mayor Fiorello LaGuardia, elected in 1933 on a reform platform, was sympathetic to labor. He refused to deploy police to break the picket line, despite pressure from hotel ownership. This was a significant departure from previous strikes, where police had arrested picketers and protected strikebreakers. The broader labor movement rallied to support the Waldorf workers. Other hotel workers threatened solidarity strikes. The Hotel Trades Council organized a support fund, collecting donations to sustain striking workers who were losing their wages. Union members from other industries, longshoremen and garment workers, and transit workers, visited the picket line to show solidarity. Management attempted to hire replacement workers, but the union effectively blocked this strategy. Picketers confronted potential strikebreakers, explaining the issues and persuading many not to cross the line. Those who did cross faced hostile treatment from striking workers and risked being blacklisted by the union if they ever wanted to work in unionized hotels later. The hotel's ownership faced a difficult calculation. Every day the strike continued, they lost revenue. Guests canceled reservations. Wealthy regulars took their business to other hotels. The Waldorf's reputation for impeccable service was being damaged in real time, reported in daily newspaper coverage. But conceding to union demands meant fundamentally changing the economic model that had made the hotel profitable. Higher wages, shorter hours, better working conditions, all meant higher labor costs. These costs would either reduce profits or force increases in room rates that might drive away price-sensitive guests. The strike entered its second week with no resolution. Both sides dug in. The workers, buoyed by public support and sustained by the union strike fund, remained committed. Management, hoping the workers would eventually run out of money and return to work, refused to negotiate seriously. The turning point came on March 21st, the sixth day of the strike. The Hotel Association of New York, representing the city's major hotels, intervened. They recognized that if the Waldorf fell, other hotels would face similar strikes. Better to negotiate a settlement now than to fight protracted battles at every property. The association brokered a meeting between hotel ownership and union representatives. The negotiations lasted 14 hours through the night and into the next morning. Both sides made concessions. The union accepted a smaller wage increase than initially demanded. Management accepted union recognition and the principle of collective bargaining. The final contract was announced on March 22nd. Wages would increase by 10% immediately, with provisions for further increases tied to hotel revenue. The workday would be limited to 9 hours, with overtime pay for additional hours. The hotel would provide free housing in the servant quarters, ending the rent charges implemented during the Depression. Workers would receive 1 day off per week, guaranteed. The union would be recognized as the exclusive bargaining agent for workers. The striking workers voted to accept the contract. On March 23rd, they returned to work. The picket line disbanded. The hotel resumed normal operations. But nothing was truly normal anymore. The power dynamics had shifted fundamentally. Workers had demonstrated that they could shut down the hotel. Management had learned that labor was not infinitely replaceable or exploitable. Guests had been forced to confront the human cost of their luxury. The Waldorf strike inspired similar actions across the country. Within 6 months, hotel workers in Chicago, San Francisco, Boston, and Los Angeles had organized and struck. By 1936, the major hotels in every major American city were unionized. The era of absolute management control over labor was over. The strike also changed labor law. The National Labor Relations Act, passed in 1935, codified many of the rights that workers had fought for during the Waldorf strike. The right to organize, the right to bargain collectively, the prohibition against firing workers for union activity. These legal protections made it possible for workers in other industries to organize more easily. Historians would later recognize the Waldorf strike as a pivotal moment in American labor history, not because it was the largest strike, or the most violent, or the most politically significant, but because it made visible what had been hidden. Because it forced society to confront the exploitation that luxury required. Because it proved that even the most powerless workers, when organized, possessed the power to change their conditions. The invisible army had stepped into the light, and the world they revealed would never again be able to hide in comfortable darkness. Chapter 8: The Fall of the Gilded Dream. After the strike, the Waldorf's pristine image began to tarnish, as the cracks in its glittering surface could no longer be ignored. The Waldorf that reopened on March 23, 1934, was not the same institution that had closed 6 days earlier. The physical building remained unchanged. The marble lobbies and crystal chandeliers still gleamed. But something intangible had been lost. The aura of effortless perfection had been punctured. Guests returning to the hotel after the strike noticed differences immediately. Service, while still professional, lacked the invisible seamlessness that had defined the Waldorf experience. Waiters were more assertive, less deferential. Chambermaids were less likely to flatten themselves against walls when guests appeared in hallways. The power dynamic had shifted subtly, but unmistakably. Some guests complained. Letters to management expressed disappointment with the new atmosphere. One regular patron wrote, "The help has become uppity. They no longer understand their place. This is not the Waldorf I have known for 20 years." These complaints revealed more about the complainers than about the service. What they were mourning was not a decline in quality, but a loss of dominance. Others recognized that the changes were overdue. A letter from a guest sympathetic to the workers praised the hotel for joining the modern era and treating employees with basic human dignity. But these progressive voices were in the minority among the Waldorf's traditional clientele. The economics of the post-strike hotel required adjustment. Labor costs increased by approximately 30%. Wages were higher. Hours were shorter, requiring more workers to maintain coverage. The hotel had to hire additional staff to compensate for the reduced workday. Management attempted to absorb these costs without raising room rates, fearing that price increases would drive away guests during the Depression. But the margins were unsustainable. By late 1934, the hotel was operating at a loss. In December of that year, room rates increased by 15%. Suites that had cost $10 now cost $11.50. Standard rooms went from $6 to $7. The price increase coincided with continuing economic hardship. The Depression, despite some recovery in 1934 and 35, still gripped the nation. Unemployment remained high. Even the wealthy were more cautious with their spending. The Waldorf's occupancy rate, which had recovered to 70% immediately after the strike, began declining again. By 1936, the hotel was in serious financial trouble. The ownership, the Astor family, considered their options. They could continue operating at a loss, hoping for economic recovery. They could sell the property, or they could close the hotel entirely. The decision was complicated by the fact that the Waldorf was not just a business. It was a symbol. The Astor name had been synonymous with New York aristocracy for over a century. The hotel represented the family's legacy, their contribution to the city's cultural landscape. Closing it would be an admission of defeat. But symbols do not pay bills. In 1937, the Astor family announced they were selling the Waldorf Hotel. The buyer was a consortium of investors who planned to demolish the building and construct a modern office tower on the valuable Fifth Avenue site. The announcement shocked the city. The Waldorf had stood for 44 years. It had hosted presidents and kings, robber barons and movie stars. It had been the setting for countless society weddings and charity balls. and now it would be destroyed, reduced to rubble to make way for something more profitable. The decision to demolish the hotel rather than repurpose it was telling. The building was designed for a specific type of operation, one that required cheap labor and minimal worker rights. The servant quarters, the separate service corridors, the hidden infrastructure, all of this made sense only in a system where workers had no power. In a unionized environment, the architecture was obsolete. A new hotel, the Waldorf Astoria, opened in 1931 at Park Avenue and 50th Street. This was a much larger and more modern property, designed to compete with the grand hotels being built in other major cities. But it was also designed to accommodate a unionized workforce. The servant quarters were replaced with proper staff housing in a separate building. Service corridors still existed, but they were wider and better lit. The two-tiered system remained, but the extremes were less pronounced. The original Waldorf closed its doors permanently on May 3, 1929, just months before the stock market crash. The timing was symbolically fitting. The hotel's demise coincided with the collapse of the economic system that had sustained it. The Gilded Age, which had begun in the decades after the Civil War and reached its peak in the 1890s, was definitively over. Demolition began in June of 1929. The crews systematically dismantled the building, salvaging materials that could be sold or repurposed. The marble from the lobby was sold to other construction projects. The chandeliers were auctioned off. The mahogany furniture was purchased by collectors. The servant quarters on the 13th floor were among the last sections to be demolished. When workers finally reached those rooms in August of 1929, they found them largely empty, but scattered remnants remained. A forgotten photograph tucked into a dresser drawer, a rosary hanging on a wall hook, a child's toy hidden under a bed. These small artifacts were the only physical evidence of the thousands of people who had lived and worked in these spaces. No one thought to preserve these items. They were swept into piles with the other debris and hauled away. The lives lived in those rooms, the suffering and the joy and the exhaustion, all of it was erased as thoroughly as the building itself. Yet the site became the Empire State Building, which opened in 1931 and became the world's tallest building. The new skyscraper was a monument to a different kind of ambition. Less about luxury and more about efficiency. Less about exclusivity and more about volume. It was built by unionized labor, workers who had rights and protections that the Waldorf workers could only have dreamed of in 1893. But the legacy of the Waldorf extended beyond the physical building. The strike of 1934 had lasting effects on the hotel industry and the broader labor movement. It established the principle that luxury hospitality workers deserved fair compensation and humane working conditions. It proved that even in an industry built on hierarchy and deference, workers could organize and win. Other industries took note. If hotel workers could successfully strike and unionize, so could retail workers, restaurant workers, domestic workers. The Waldorf strike became a template, a case study in effective organizing and collective action. Labor organizers in the 1930s and 40s explicitly referenced the Waldorf when recruiting workers in other sectors. "Remember what the Waldorf workers achieved," they would say. "If they could stand up to the Astors, you can stand up to your boss." But the victory was incomplete. The union contract improved conditions, but it did not fundamentally alter the economic system. Their workers still earned far less than the value they created. The wealth generated by their labor still flowed primarily to owners and investors. The power imbalance, while reduced, remained substantial. And as the decades passed, even the gains of the 1930s eroded. Union membership declined. Labor protections weakened. The balance of power shifted back toward capital. By the early 21st century, many hotel workers in New York and other cities faced conditions eerily similar to those that had sparked the Waldorf strike. Low wages, long hours, minimal benefits. The dream of the Gilded Age, the vision of a society where the wealthy could enjoy unlimited luxury sustained by invisible labor, did not die with the demolition of the Waldorf. It simply evolved, adapted, found new forms. The specific mechanisms changed, but the fundamental equation remained. Wealth requires poverty. Luxury requires exploitation. Comfort for some requires suffering by others. The Waldorf's fall was not the end of this system. It was a temporary disruption, a moment when the contradictions became too visible to ignore. But once the building was demolished and the immediate crisis passed, the system reasserted itself. The question that haunted the ruins of the Waldorf was whether lasting change was possible, whether a more just and equitable arrangement could be built, whether luxury and fairness could coexist. The strike had proven that workers had power. But did they have enough power to fundamentally transform the system? The answer, decades later, remains unclear. The Waldorf is gone. The workers who fought there are long dead. But the struggle they embodied continues in hotels and restaurants and offices and factories around the world. The invisible army keeps fighting to be seen. Chapter 9. A legacy of hidden labor. Even after the strike, the legacy of the Waldorf's hidden labor force continued to echo through the halls of history. The photographs taken during the 1934 strike are haunting. Black and white images of women in chambermaid uniforms holding picket signs. Men in porter caps standing shoulder to shoulder on Fifth Avenue. Their faces show exhaustion, determination, and something harder to define. Perhaps hope. Perhaps desperation. Perhaps both. These images circulated widely in newspapers at the time. They were reprinted in labor publications and union organizing materials for decades afterward. They became icons of the American labor movement, visual proof that workers could stand up to power and win. But who were these people? What happened to them after the cameras stopped clicking and the newspapers moved on to other stories? Archival research provides fragmentary answers. Union records contain lists of workers who participated in the strike. Hotel employment records show who returned to work and who did not. Census data and death certificates track some of the workers through the years that followed. Marie Kowalski, the Polish immigrant who arrived in 1902 and worked as a chambermaid, lived to see the strike. She was 51 years old in 1934, still working at the Waldorf, still living in the same room on the 13th floor she had occupied for 32 years. She walked out with the others on March 15th and stood on the picket line for 6 days. After the strike, Marie continued working until 1939, when failing health forced her to retire. She had saved almost nothing from her decades of labor. She moved to a Catholic charity home for elderly women in Brooklyn, where she died in 1943. She was 60 years old. The death certificate lists the cause as tuberculosis, the disease that killed so many workers who had spent their lives in poorly ventilated spaces. Albert Morrison, the waiter who was among the first to walk out on the evening of March 15th, became a union organizer after the strike. He traveled to other cities, helping hotel workers organize. He was skilled at articulating the grievances that workers felt but struggled to express. His 16 years of experience at the Waldorf gave him credibility. Albert worked for the Hotel Trades Council until 1952, when he retired at age 65. Unlike Marie, he had managed to save money, in part because union organizing paid better than waiting tables. He lived comfortably in a small apartment in Queens until his death in 1961. Rosa Sanchez, the chambermaid who gave the powerful interview to the New York Times during the strike, returned to work at the Waldorf, but only for a few months. She used the credibility and connections from the strike to get a job as a housekeeper at a smaller, unionized hotel that paid better wages and offered better conditions. She worked there until 1950, then opened a small boarding house in the Bronx. She died in 1972, one of the few Waldorf workers who achieved modest financial security. Not all the stories ended well. Some workers who participated in the strike were blacklisted, unable to find work in the hotel industry afterward. Management kept lists of troublemakers and shared them with other hotels. These workers had to find employment in other sectors, often at lower wages and worse conditions than they had endured at the Waldorf. Others returned to work but faced subtle retaliation, less desirable shift assignments, more scrutiny from supervisors, slower advancement. The union contract provided some protection, but it could not prevent all forms of discrimination. The strike had broader effects on the families of workers. Children of Waldorf workers grew up hearing stories about the 1934 walkout. For some, it instilled a commitment to labor organizing and workers' rights. Several children of strikers became union officials themselves, carrying forward the struggle their parents had begun. The cultural impact of the strike extended beyond the labor movement, and writers and artists drew inspiration from the story. John Dos Passos incorporated fictionalized versions of Waldorf workers into his novel The Big Money, published in 1936. The photographer Berenice Abbott captured images of hotel workers in New York during the Depression, consciously documenting the invisible labor force. The strike also influenced academic research. Sociologists and labor historians began studying the conditions of service workers with new seriousness. Before the Waldorf strike, most academic attention focused on industrial workers in factories and mines. Service workers, especially those in luxury industries, were largely ignored. But the strike demonstrated that service work was not fundamentally different from industrial work. It involved exploitation, poor conditions, and the systematic extraction of surplus value from labor. Academic studies in the late 1930s and 1940s documented the wages, hours, and working conditions of hotel workers, laundry workers, restaurant workers, and domestic servants. This research provided empirical support for labor organizing and for policy changes. The Fair Labor Standards Act of 1938, which established a federal minimum wage and overtime pay requirements, drew on studies of service workers influenced by the Waldorf strike. The legacy lived on in the physical spaces as well, though in unexpected ways. The Empire State Building, built on the site of the original Waldorf, became a Union stronghold. The construction workers who built it were unionized. The maintenance workers who kept it running were unionized. The office workers who staffed its floors increasingly organized through the 1940s and 50s. The building that replaced the Waldorf thus became a monument to what the Waldorf workers had fought for. Not a monument of marble and gold celebrating wealth and luxury, but a working building filled with organized labor, a testament to the power of collective action. Museum collections now hold artifacts from the Waldorf, not the grand chandeliers or expensive furniture that were sold at auction, but the mundane items of workers' lives. A time card from a chambermaid, a staff manual outlining service procedures, a photograph of workers in the servant quarters. These objects, preserved by accident or foresight, provide material evidence of lives that were meant to be invisible. Contemporary labor movements continue to invoke the Waldorf strike. When hotel workers in Los Angeles struck in 2004, or when casino workers in Las Vegas organized in 2015, organizers reference the history. 70 years ago, workers at the most prestigious hotel in New York stood up and won. You can do the same. But the reference cuts both ways. The Waldorf strike also demonstrates the limits of labor action. The workers won significant concessions in 1934, but those gains did not fundamentally transform the industry. Hotel workers today still face low wages, irregular hours, and inadequate benefits. The fight continues because the underlying system has not changed. The legacy raises uncomfortable questions. If a successful strike at a high-profile hotel during a period of favorable political climate could not permanently improve conditions for service workers, what will? Is reform sufficient, or does the entire economic system need to be reimagined? These questions have no easy answers. But the Waldorf workers offer something valuable, regardless. Proof that change is possible. Evidence that even the most powerless can claim power through solidarity. And a reminder that what seems permanent can be disrupted. The servants who lived on the 13th floor and worked in the basement are gone. The building they maintained has been demolished, but their story persists. In union halls and history books, in the memories of descendants and the scholarship of researchers, in every hotel worker who refuses to accept exploitation as inevitable. The invisible army, once forced into visibility, cannot be made invisible again. The knowledge of their existence, their suffering, and their resistance is now part of the historical record. Future generations can choose to ignore it, but they cannot erase it. The legacy of the Waldorf's hidden labor force is this: that luxury has a cost, that someone always pays, that invisibility is not natural but constructed, that what is constructed can be deconstructed, that workers have always fought back, and they always will. Chapter 10. The Rise of a New Luxury. As the Gilded Age gave way to new economic realities, luxury hotels began to change, but the hidden costs remained the same. The Waldorf Astoria that opened in 1931 represented a new vision of luxury hospitality. The building was taller, 47 stories compared to the original Waldorf's 13. It contained 2,200 rooms, nearly 5 times the capacity of its predecessor. It occupied an entire city block on Park Avenue, but the most significant changes were invisible to guests. The new hotel was designed for a post-strike, unionized workforce. The architecture acknowledged, in ways the original Waldorf never had, that workers were human beings deserving of basic dignity. Staff housing was located in a separate building rather than on a hidden floor of the main structure. The rooms were larger, with private bathrooms becoming standard rather than exceptional. Common areas included recreation spaces where workers could socialize during their limited free time. The architectural segregation remained. Workers and guests still inhabited different worlds, but the extremes were less pronounced. Working conditions improved, gradually and incompletely. The 9-hour workday established by the 1934 strike became the industry standard. Overtime pay for hours beyond 40 per week was mandated by federal law in 1938. Minimum wage laws set a floor below which wages could not fall, though that floor remained well below a living wage. Union representation gave workers a mechanism to address grievances without risking immediate termination. Shop stewards could challenge unfair treatment. Contract negotiations happened regularly, allowing workers to advocate for improved conditions. The power imbalance remained, but it was no longer absolute. These improvements came at a cost to ownership. The labor expenses at the new Waldorf Astoria were significantly higher than at the original Waldorf. But the hotel remained profitable because it adapted its business model. Room rates were higher. The target clientele was slightly different. And efficiency improvements in technology offset some of the increased labor costs. The new hotel featured centralized air conditioning, eliminating the need for workers to manually adjust windows and ventilation. Automated dishwashing machines reduced the need for manual dishwashers. Electric elevators were faster and more reliable than the older hydraulic systems, requiring fewer operators. Technology began to replace labor where possible. This pattern repeated across the luxury hotel industry. As labor costs increased due to unionization, hotels invested in technology to reduce their dependence on workers. It was not a conspiracy or a deliberate effort to undermine unions. It was simple economics. When labor becomes more expensive, capital substitutes machines. The long-term implications of this trend would not become fully apparent until the late 20th and early 21st centuries, when automation and artificial intelligence began to eliminate entire categories of service work. But the seeds were planted in the 1930s, when hotels responded to worker power by seeking alternatives to human labor. Meanwhile, the concept of luxury itself evolved. The ostentatious displays of wealth that characterized the Gilded Age became less fashionable during the Depression and World War II. Conspicuous consumption seemed tone-deaf when millions were suffering. The new luxury emphasized understated elegance, quality over quantity, sophistication rather than excess. This shift was partly aesthetic, but it was also economic. The super-wealthy of the Gilded Age, the robber barons and industrial magnates, lost much of their wealth during the Depression. Estate taxes and progressive income taxes introduced during the New Deal redistributed some wealth. The extreme concentration of resources that had characterized the late 19th and early 20th centuries diminished. The luxury hotel industry adapted by targeting a broader market, not just the ultra-wealthy, but the upper middle class. Business travelers with expense accounts, wealthy families on vacation. The democratization of luxury meant that more people could afford to stay at prestigious hotels, but it also meant that the service experience became more standardized and less personalized. The post-war economic boom of the 1950s and 60s created new opportunities for luxury hospitality. Hotel chains expanded across the country and internationally. Brands like Hilton and Sheraton built properties in every major city. These were not bespoke hotels with unique character. They were standardized products, offering predictable service and amenities. Unionization spread along with the industry. By the 1960s, most major hotels in urban areas were unionized. The Hotel Employees and Restaurant Employees International Union, formed from the merger of several craft unions, represented hundreds of thousands of workers. Collective bargaining agreements established industry-wide standards for wages, benefits, and working conditions. But even as conditions improved for some workers, new forms of exploitation emerged. Hotels began to rely increasingly on part-time and temporary workers who were not covered by union contracts. Housekeeping, in particular, became a category dominated by immigrant women working without benefits or job security. The two-tiered workforce, permanent unionized employees and precarious contingent workers, created new inequalities. The luxury hotel industry also globalized. American hotel brands expanded to Europe, Asia, and Latin America. In many of these countries, labor protections were weaker or non-existent. Hotels could pay workers even less than in the United States while charging comparable or higher room rates. The profit margins were extraordinary. This globalization created a race to the bottom. Hotels in countries with strong labor protections faced pressure to reduce costs to compete with properties in countries where workers had no rights. The solution was often to outsource labor-intensive services. Laundry was sent to industrial facilities in low-wage areas. Food preparation was contracted to catering companies. Housekeeping was provided by staffing agencies rather than hotel employees. By the late 20th century, the hotel industry had found ways to maintain luxury while minimizing direct employment. A guest at a five-star hotel might interact with a dozen workers during their stay, but few, if any, of those workers would actually be employees of the hotel. They were contractors, vendors, subcontractors, workers twice or three times removed from the entity, profiting from their labor. This system was in many ways more insidious than the explicit exploitation of the Gilded Age. At least the Waldorf directly employed its workers, creating a clear relationship between the company and the people who served its guests. The modern hotel industry obscured that relationship, making it difficult to assign responsibility or accountability. Workers' movements adapted to these new realities. Campaigns like Justice for Janitors in the 1980s and 90s organized subcontracted workers who were excluded from traditional union structures. These campaigns achieved significant victories, proving that even the most precarious workers could organize if the strategies were creative enough. But the fundamental tension remained. Luxury requires labor. Labor deserves fair compensation. Fair compensation reduces profit. The system cannot resolve this contradiction. It can only manage it, shifting the balance of power between capital and labor, depending on political and economic conditions. The rise of the new luxury was not a story of progress. It was a story of adaptation. The industry learned to maintain profitability while accommodating worker demands. But it never abandoned the core model of extracting maximum value from labor while providing minimum compensation. The dream of the Waldorf, the vision of effortless luxury sustained by invisible labor, persisted. It simply found new forms, new architectures, new justifications. The servants' quarters moved off-site. The workers became contractors. The exploitation became abstracted and diffuse, but it did not disappear. Chapter 11. The Ghosts of the Waldorf. Long after the Waldorf's doors closed, the memory of the workers who served behind the scenes still lingers in the city's history. The building is gone. The Empire State Building occupies the site now, its Art Deco spire rising 1,454 feet above the streets where chambermaids once walked to work. But memory does not require physical structures. It lives in stories, in documents, in the consciousness of those who choose to remember. The New York Public Library holds the Waldorf Hotel Archive, a collection of materials donated by the Astor family and supplemented by acquisitions over the decades. The collection includes ledgers, staff rosters, guest registers, photographs, and architectural drawings. Researchers can spend days sifting through these materials, reconstructing the daily operations of the hotel. But the archive has gaps. The perspectives it preserves are predominantly those of management and ownership. Guest experiences are documented through letters and comment cards. Architectural decisions are explained through blueprints and correspondence. Financial performance is tracked through accounting records. The workers' voices are largely absent. They wrote few letters that were preserved. They left no memoirs describing their experiences. Their perspectives were not considered worth documenting by those who controlled the archive. What we know about the workers' lives comes from indirect sources. Union records that list names and occasionally include testimony from organizing drives and strikes. Census records that provide basic demographic information. Death certificates that reveal causes of death and ages at death, often tragically young. Newspaper articles that quoted workers during the strike, but rarely followed up on their stories afterward. These fragmentary sources can be assembled into a partial picture, but the picture is incomplete, haunted by absences and silences. Local historians and community organizations have worked to fill these gaps. The Hotel Trades Council maintains an oral history project, collecting interviews with retired hotel workers. Some of these workers remember hearing stories from their parents or grandparents about the early days of the industry, including the Waldorf. The Tenement Museum on the Lower East Side includes exhibits about service workers in the early 20th century. While not focused specifically on the Waldorf, the museum contextualizes the experiences of hotel workers within the broader immigrant experience in New York. Walking tours of Midtown Manhattan sometimes include stops at the site of the original Waldorf. Tour guides tell condensed versions of the hotel's history, usually focusing on the famous guests and architectural innovations. Some guides mention the strike, though it is often presented as a footnote rather than a central part of the story. But a few guides, particularly those associated with labor history organizations, foreground the workers' experience. They describe the servant quarters, the working conditions, the 1934 strike. They name specific workers like Marie Kowalski and Rosa Sanchez. They insist that the history of luxury cannot be separated from the history of labor. These efforts at remembrance are important, but they reach limited audiences. Most people who walk past the Empire State Building have no idea that the Waldorf Hotel once stood there. Fewer still know about the 600 workers who lived and labored in its hidden spaces. This forgetting is not accidental. It reflects whose stories are considered worth preserving. The wealthy leave archives because they have the resources and education to create documents. The poor leave traces because traces are all they can afford. But occasionally, something material survives. A photograph discovered in an estate sale, a diary found in a thrift store, a collection of letters donated to a historical society. These chance survivals allow glimpses into lives that were meant to be invisible. One such discovery occurred in 2008, when a demolition crew working on an old apartment building in Queens found a trunk in a sealed crawl space. Inside were the belongings of Mary Sullivan, the chambermaid who had lived in room 1327 from 1894 to 1905. The trunk contained her work dresses, carefully preserved, a small leather journal with sporadic entries in neat handwriting, a collection of postcards showing views of New York at the turn of the century, and a handful of photographs, including one of Mary in her chambermaid uniform, standing in front of the Waldorf Hotel. The journal entries were brief and often cryptic. Another long day, feet aching. Mr. Henderson complained about the pillows. I was reprimanded. Sent money home to mother. But they provided rare first-person testimony of the work and its toll. The Queen's Historical Society now preserves Mary Sullivan's trunk and its contents. It has been featured in several exhibitions about women's work and immigrant experiences. Her photograph, the chambermaid standing before the Grand Hotel where she earned $6 a week, has become an iconic image. These ghosts, these fragmentary traces of forgotten lives, serve a purpose beyond mere historical curiosity. They challenge the dominant narratives of American success and luxury. They insist that the Gilded Age was not just about magnificent buildings and wealthy patrons. It was also about exploitation and suffering and quiet endurance. The contemporary relevance is unmistakable. Service workers today face many of the same challenges that Waldorf workers faced a century ago. Low wages, long hours, limited benefits, precarious employment. The specific forms have changed, but the fundamental dynamics remain. When hotel workers in New York struck in 2018, seeking higher wages and protections against sexual harassment, they were continuing the struggle that began at the Waldorf in 1934. The demands were not identical, the context was different, but the core issue was the same: workers demanding to be treated with dignity and compensated fairly for their labor. The strikers carried signs echoing those from decades earlier. Fair wages now. Respect hotel workers. The visual continuity was striking. History does not repeat, but it rhymes. The memory of the Waldorf workers provides inspiration and guidance for contemporary labor movements. It demonstrates that change is possible, and that workers can win even when the odds seem impossible. But it also provides cautionary lessons, that victories can be partial and temporary, that power must be constantly defended, that forgetting history means repeating it. The ghosts of the Waldorf linger not in the Empire State Building or any physical location. They linger in the ongoing struggle for economic justice. In every hotel worker who refuses to accept exploitation. In every union organizing drive. In every strike. In every demand for dignity. The invisible army, though long dead, is not powerless. Their story, when told and retold, becomes a weapon for those who continue their fight. Memory is not passive. It is active, shaping consciousness and inspiring action. The Waldorf workers deserve to be remembered not as victims, though they were victimized, not as heroes, though they showed courage, but as human beings who resisted injustice and won partial victories in a system designed to keep them powerless. Their legacy is the knowledge that exploitation is not inevitable, that invisibility is not natural, that power can be challenged and sometimes overcome, that the servants can walk out of the servants' quarters and demand to be seen, and once seen, they cannot be erased. Chapter 12: The Cost of Dreams. What price are we willing to pay for luxury, and who bears the burden of our dreams? The Waldorf Hotel was built on a simple equation. Wealthy guests wanted luxury. Luxury required labor. Labor could be made cheap through systematic exploitation. As long as the workers remained invisible, the equation seemed natural, even inevitable. But invisibility was always an illusion. The workers were there all along, cleaning the rooms, cooking the meals, carrying the luggage. The architecture hid them. The social conventions ignored them. The economic system ensured they had no voice. But they existed, they suffered, and eventually they resisted. The story of the Waldorf is the story of American capitalism in miniature. The dream of unlimited wealth. The reality of limited resources. The solution of extracting value from those with no power to refuse. The inevitable conflict when the powerless organize and demand their share. This pattern repeats across industries and eras. The plantation economy of the South. The factory towns of the Industrial Revolution. The tech companies of the 21st century. Different settings, different specifics, but the same fundamental dynamic. Wealth concentrates at the top by extracting value from the bottom. The Gilded Age gave this dynamic its purest expression. Inequality reached levels not seen before or since in American history. The richest 1% controlled more than 40% of the nation's wealth. The poorest 50% controlled less than 2%. The Waldorf was both a symbol and an engine of this inequality. It symbolized what extreme wealth could achieve, the beauty and comfort and pleasure that unlimited resources could produce. And it was an engine that generated wealth for the Astor family and other investors by systematically underpaying workers. The strike of 1934 disrupted the engine, but did not dismantle it. Workers won concessions, but the system adapted and continued. Luxury hotels still exist. Workers still clean rooms for wages that barely cover rent and food. The invisible army is still invisible to most of the guests it serves. But something changed after the Waldorf strike. The myth of effortless luxury was punctured. Society could no longer pretend that grand hotels simply existed, maintained by mysterious forces. Everyone knew that real people, with real struggles and real grievances, made the luxury possible. This knowledge created obligations. If we know that our comfort depends on someone else's suffering, what are we morally required to do? The easy answer is to pay fair wages, provide good working conditions, treat workers with dignity. But this answer raises difficult questions. What is a fair wage? Enough to survive or enough to thrive? Enough for one person or enough to support a family? Enough for basic needs or enough to save for the future? These questions have no objective answers. They require value judgments about what we owe each other and what kind of society we want to create. The market cannot answer these questions. Markets allocate resources based on supply and demand, not on moral desert. In a labor market with high unemployment, wages fall regardless of whether those wages allow workers to live decently. In a market where workers have no bargaining power, they will be exploited regardless of the value they create. This is why the Waldorf workers had to strike. The market would not deliver fair compensation. Only collective action, only the threat of shutting down the hotel could force management to negotiate. And even then, the workers had to settle for less than they demanded, accepting a compromise that still left them economically precarious. The deeper question is whether luxury and fairness can coexist. Is it possible to create genuinely excellent hospitality while paying all workers enough to live comfortably? Or does luxury require inequality? The concentration of resources that allows some to live extraordinarily well while others barely survive. Some argue that inequality is necessary for excellence, that without the possibility of extreme wealth, people will not innovate or work hard. That luxury goods and services require skilled workers who command premium wages, and that premium wages for the skilled necessarily mean low wages for the unskilled. Others argue that this is false necessity, that societies with less inequality produce equivalent or superior quality of life for everyone, that the concentration of luxury among the few is less valuable than widespread comfort for the many, that we could have excellent hotels that treat all workers well if we were willing to pay slightly higher prices and accept slightly lower profit margins. The Waldorf offers evidence for both positions. It demonstrates that truly exceptional luxury was achieved through exploitation, and the original hotel was magnificent, precisely because no expense was spared on materials and design, while every penny was squeezed from labor costs. The new Waldorf Astoria, built with higher labor costs, was excellent but arguably less exceptional than its predecessor. But the Waldorf also demonstrates that exploitation is unsustainable. The system that created the original hotel collapsed within 40 years. The strike, the depression, the changing social values, all made it impossible to continue operating under the old model. The building was demolished not because it was physically deteriorating, but because it was economically and socially obsolete. Perhaps the lesson is that there are no permanent solutions, that the balance between capital and labor is constantly negotiated and renegotiated, that periods of extreme inequality generate resistance, which produces reform, which eventually erodes as power concentrations rebuild. The history of the past century seems to support this cyclical view. The Gilded Age gave way to the Progressive Era and the New Deal, which established labor rights and reduced inequality. But those gains eroded during the late 20th century, and we now live in a second Gilded Age with inequality approaching the levels of 1900. Will this generate a new wave of reform and labor organizing? Some signs suggest yes. Strikes have increased in recent years. Workers at previously non-union companies like Amazon and Starbucks are organizing. Public opinion increasingly supports higher wages and better working conditions. But other signs suggest that this time might be different. Technology allows companies to replace workers with machines in ways that were impossible a century ago. Globalization allows companies to relocate work to countries with weaker labor protections. The political power of capital has increased to the point where meaningful reform seems almost impossible. The Waldorf workers fought and won because they had leverage. They could shut down the hotel, and the hotel could not easily replace them. Modern workers often lack this leverage. A hotel can outsource its housekeeping. A restaurant can replace waiters with tablets and automated delivery. The invisible army can be made not just invisible, but unnecessary. This is the nightmare scenario. Not that workers will be exploited, but that they will be discarded. That technology will eliminate their jobs while providing no alternative means of survival. That the choice will not be between fair wages and exploitation, but between exploitation and unemployment. Yet even in this dark scenario, the lesson of the Waldorf remains relevant. Workers have power when they organize collectively. Technology cannot eliminate all forms of service work, and political action can establish guardrails that prevent the worst outcomes. The cost of dreams is always paid by someone. The question is who pays and how much, and whether we consider that cost acceptable. The Waldorf workers paid with their health, their youth, their dignity. They created beauty and luxury that they themselves could never enjoy. They sustained the dreams of the wealthy, while their own dreams of security and comfort remained unfulfilled. We can accept this as inevitable, as the natural order of things, or we can recognize it as a choice a system created by humans and therefore changeable by humans. The Waldorf workers chose to resist. Their resistance was imperfect and incomplete, but it was real. Their legacy is the knowledge that we do not have to accept the world as it is. That what has been built can be rebuilt differently. That the invisible can become visible, and the powerless can claim power, and the dreams of the few can become the dreams of the many. The cost of dreams need not always fall on those who can least afford to pay. Another world is possible. The Waldorf workers proved it. They showed that workers could stand together and demand change. They showed that luxury was not magic, but labor, and that labor deserved compensation and respect. The building is gone. The workers are gone. But the question they posed remains: what price are we willing to pay for luxury, and who bears the burden of our dreams? The answer we give will determine what kind of society we become.